This is 15 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series on permitting reforms, we're going to talk with Christina Hayes, Executive Director of Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, which represents utilities, developers, environmentalists, labor interests, and consumers in calling for transmission expansion and transmission modernization. We're going to talk about how permitting reforms can achieve those goals. Christina began her almost 30-year legal career with Oregon's Court of Appeals and Oregon's Public Utility Commission before moving to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as legal advisor, first to the General Counsel and to Chair John Wellinghoff. After over 6 years in federal regulatory affairs with power sector powerhouse Berkshire Hathaway Energy, she took the lead with Americans for Clean Energy Grid in July 2022. So, Christina, I think people have been talking about reforming federal permitting practices at least since July 2022 and probably a long time before that. Before we talk about solutions, why are reforms of the federal practices for permitting transmission projects so urgently needed? What are the causes, the long delays in permitting at the federal level?
Well, first, we are going to need a lot more power and a lot more power lines to meet increasing demand from manufacturing, semiconductors, data center, and so much more. That means eliminating the crazy patchwork quilt of federal agencies, state approvals, and local governments involved in siting large-scale transmission, which can delay project timelines by a decade or more. The federal permitting framework should apply equally to all linear energy infrastructure, requiring the same jurisdiction and the same single point of accountability over large-scale electric transmission lines as FERC's current role in interstate gas pipeline approval under the Natural Gas Act.
Yeah, you mentioned agencies. There's a long list of agencies that are involved and each one does a specific review. So it's like they just mount up in terms of time, right?
They really do. And SunZia is a great example or a terrible example, depending
That's
on
a
how you look
transmission
at it.
project that goes from like what, New Mexico to California or something like that?
Right, it was about 550 miles. It required approvals from 10 federal agencies, 5 state agencies, 9 local authorities before permits were in place. It took 17 years from initial conception till ground was broken. It just started delivering power to 1 million homes starting next year in 2026.
Yeah, and it's so frustrating because there's so much great solar energy and wind energy in those regions that it crosses. It's so frustrating that it didn't it took so long to get it. I remember writing about it well over a decade ago. But I want to move to some specifics, Christina, because everybody talks about delays. Nobody really gets into the specifics. And we're going to be getting into the specifics on Capitol Hill in the fall. I've heard Bechtel Corporation said that it's got to get done this fall, or it's not going to get done. And I think a lot of people in the clean energy industries feel very similarly. There's been one thing. Let's start with one thing. There's been a widely supported call for something called programmatic National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, reviews that would shorten the delays in permitting. So tell us what NEPA reviews are. Tell us what programmatic NEPA reviews are, and tell us why that's a solution.
Programmatic NEPA reviews apply well in some situations, but not others. They're
Ah,
essentially a type of broad or high-level environmental review to evaluate potential environmental impacts of broad federal actions. It works when you're applying it to a series of related actions or a single large-scale initiative that will be implemented over time or across multiple locations. The challenge is when you have the programmatic review assessment, more specific actions have to be supplemented by tiered or supplemental NEPA reviews that build on top of that programmatic analysis. So it really depends on the scope of the initial programmatic NEPA review in terms of how many projects it will cover how specific it can be. And then on top of that, you may need, depending on the variations or the deviations, the additional tiered or supplemental reviews, which can then add additional time.
Let's stop on that a minute. National Environmental Policy Act was created, I think it was the 70s, if I'm not
That's
mistaken.
right. Yeah.
I've read that originally the thought that the reviews, that mostly they're environmental impact reviews, I think, if I'm not, is that right? Is that correct?
Environmental impact statements for significant federal actions, and then there are also environmental analysis, right, for less
Yeah.
significant.
And I think the original legislators sort of thought of these things as like maybe take a year, careful study, maybe 150 pages. But I can remember looking at reviews for SunZia and for that transmission line that runs from Wyoming to California that has recently been um,
Transwest
permitted.
Express?
Transwest Express, that's the one. Um, there were volumes. The environmental impact statements were like several volumes long. Um, so is the programmatic idea, is that like a template? So you kind of go down through a specific set of concerns and check off that you've done the right. Is that why it's supposed to shorten things?
That could be helpful when applied across a large area or let me begin again. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
That Programmatic reviews work when they're applied to similar projects across a wide area. The challenge is those two projects that you identified cross multiple offices, so
Mhm.
multiple Bureau of Land Management offices. What's really helpful is to get that single point of accountability to really vest authority in one office. So one place where it's been done well is Greenlink in Nevada, where there are
Ah,
multiple field offices that have really been coordinated well by the state director and also uh, the state environmental review processes have also connected with that same federal review process. So it's done in one place, one time. And I think that's really the goal with a successful programmatic review. So whether it's done through a programmatic NEPA review or some other single point of accountability, it's really important to narrow down the number of decision points, the number of overlay over the number of overlapping layers of
yeah,
review.
there
It's
you go.
important to limit that so that we can build in a timely fashion.
Yeah, yeah, the repetition. Another solution that people have talked about is to set timelines for some of the reviews that come. So that these reviews are done, and then federal agencies have to sign off on parts of them for transmission projects, or they have to sign off on the overall review. And now you're running into another review process, and then there's something called a judicial review that comes in where if people have objections to the decisions that are made, they can take it to court. And that's another set of timelines that you have to deal with. So people have proposed setting limits on these times that are allowed, um, both for federal agency reviews and for judicial reviews. Do you know much about the timelines that are possible or what is workable in terms of shortening those timelines? And also, do you like that idea? In other words, you're cutting off the amount of time. Is that going to solve the problem?
Well, and in transmission, it's even more bonkers, right? Because you have the federal siting and permitting process, get to record of decision, start to work through the court process. Like you said, it's a 6-year period for judicial review. Then after that, after the federal record of decision has come out, then you have the state siting and permitting process. And depending on the state, you may even have a local process that dovetails in with that. So it is so many layers. That's why that single point of accountability through FERC, just like pipelines have, would be so really helpful. Under the Natural Gas Act, it's actually a much shorter period of review than the 6 years. That might be quite short. I think it's something like 60 days, 180 days. It's quite short. I know under the uh, the dashboard I'm going to get this wrong, but there's the dashboard, the FIPSI process with the accelerated timelines. And so that has like a 2-year period of judicial review. So I know that's been heralded as certainly an improvement over 6 years. But even having that shortened period at the end of the Natural Gas Act review, what really makes that work is having strong upfront engagement with landowners and communities so that people know that this is coming and they have a chance to have input to say, maybe we shouldn't put the infrastructure through my driveway. Maybe we could put it along the fence line, or maybe it could go along the edge of this community rather than through the heart of it. And so having that early engagement, like we have for pipelines in the pre-application process, really helps mitigate a lot of the challenges that then need to be addressed in that back end in the judicial review period.
Yeah. Is there any concern that cutting off the amount of time that is available for review could, I don't know, how would you say it, reduce the quality of the review in a way that endangers, our environment or our flora and fauna?
Well, and nobody wants that, right? So the challenge is, though, a 6-year period is really just much too long. We've seen
Right.
these processes end up in do loops, right? And so, it gets vacated, it goes back to the beginning. We have siting and permitting processes that are, old enough to drive and verging on old enough to drink. That is not okay, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
and there are methods and steps that can be taken to mitigate the challenges that come up in litigation, really through a strong, constructive front end communicative process. So the people who want to work with development can have meaningful opportunity to engage. Those who just want to say no for its own sake, they're always going to be involved in the back end, and we should not draw out judicial review to allow more space for that. But really have the focus of judicial review be spotlighted on constructive addressing of challenges in order to build this really necessary infrastructure.
Okay, in the few minutes that we have left, Christina, I want to just ask you, you've already touched on it, the state and local issues. We've talked to other people on the podcast who have said just what you said, that at the state and local levels, that early engagement is crucial. But there's another concept that I've heard, a voice, not a veto. People at the state and local levels need to have a voice, but maybe shouldn't have a veto for projects. At those levels, you're dealing with lawmakers at the state level and regulating agencies. And at the local level, you've got developers and you've got advocacy groups working, and we've seen advocacy groups take a larger and larger role. So we don't have a lot of time, but what do you think about this idea of a voice, not a veto? And what do you think is the key? Do you think that there's any other solution than just early engagement and hoping you can convince folks?
I think this goes back to some of the thinking around the programmatic NEPA review in terms of we need to have a consistent mission across administrations and really a consistent mission across the country, that this infrastructure is needed to power our economy, to power our daily lives, to power our national security apparatus, to power data centers that are key to all of the things I just mentioned. If you have a smartphone in your pocket, you are engaged in this new economy, and that requires the infrastructure to go with it. We're not going to be able to power it with hopes and dreams and magical fairy dust, new generation that's just around the corner. It's always just around the corner, right? The
Yeah.
magical new generation resource that we're going to put on every corner. That's just not how it works. And so we need to have a common understanding as to what the goal is. And the goal is to make the most of the generation resources that we have now and will have in the future, to do it in the most cost-effective and reliable way. And that absolutely requires transmission. So it's really important that states get engaged early in a single process. States can get engaged, for instance, in the CITAP process under federal law that allows DOE to be the single point of accountability, really focused on large-scale, multi-state, regionally significant transmission lines. There should be coordination between states so that they can help, one state can help its neighbor in time of need, and they can also receive the benefit of that help, right? In that way, transmission is sort of like an insurance policy. We need to streamline state processes so we don't have that much redundancy. One of the other challenges, thinking about advocacy groups, so often it's just the people who say no who show up in these proceedings, right? So you have the developer and you have the NIMBYs, but you don't have kind of the broader voice of we recognize that we need this infrastructure to power our lives and we are okay doing what needs to be done. So even having those voices, I think, would be really helpful in those forums.
Yeah, yeah. Have you heard this term YIMBYs that's starting to emerge?
Yes, in my backyard, sure.
Yes, in my backyard. Yeah, there are people who have reached the point where they understand the need, as you have so well described, and so they're able to say yes. It's something that we're going to need to see more of. But we're out of time, Christina. So I want to thank you. My guest has been Christina Hayes, Executive Director of Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. Check it out. It's a really important organization right now. She's described why we have need for reforms for permitting practices that can open the way to expanding and modernizing barely adequate and aging U.S. transmission system. As always, I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.